Hello, East Bay community. My name is Erin Harrell, and
I'm Leyla Eraslan.
we are both counselor faculty at CSU East Bay. And we're coming to you to spend a little bit of time talking about microaggressions and how to manage them. As a person who walks through the world with a targeted identity, there can be many things in the world that might be upsetting. And one of these is undoubtedly microaggressions. Now, you've heard the term thrown around, but let's just sort of define it basically. A microaggression is an indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group. So what does that actually mean? Leyla, do you want to give us some examples?
I do. I mean, I do and I don't. But yeah, these things happen. And like being able to recognize a microaggression can kind of help us not internalize them quite as much. So an example might be if I said to Erin, "Hey, Erin, is your husband coming to the party tonight?"
Ouch.
Yeah, because not only does that assume that Erin is straight, it also just puts the spotlight on her identity in a way that may be uncomfortable. And then it's on her to have to like correct and say, actually, that's not a thing. So that's one way that can kind of go down. Another example that comes up a lot is saying sir or ma'am, or assuming someone's gender based on any number of factors. So that can be really invalidating and make people feel like, oh, I'm not really being seen the way that I want to be seen, or oh, it's not okay for me to be the identity that I actually hold. So those are some examples of how microaggressions could come up for us.
And the word is micro, which means small, but actually they can have a really big impact on us. In that moment when we are feeling unseen, or we feel like someone's trying to tell us that who and what we are is not okay, we can feel unsafe. And in that way, experiencing a microaggression can feel like a trauma. And it can trigger the same response as a trauma. So flight, which we may want to run away; fight, we may want to aggress against the other person or fight back; or freeze. They say something to us and we feel so bad, we just don't say anything and we freeze. And this is very common. This is very understandable. And it can really throw our body and our physiology really out of whack, just all of a sudden. So I think it can be important to try some strategies to help us manage that response. So the first strategy is breathing. Breathing is really so important when we're feeling very activated. It's important to breathe slowly and deeply. Some people do abdominal breathing, where they focus on extending and distending their abdomen very slowly and deeply to really help re-regulate the nervous system. Another strategy that helps sort of with calming the nervous system can be focusing on your 5 senses. So basically it's sort of like 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can touch, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. And that can, help ground you in your body, bring you back in the moment, and help sort of regulate the activation in your nervous system.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that we've been saying is like microaggressions invalidate our experience. And that's part of why it can be so painful and so dysregulating. So actually turning towards what does validate my experience. I know that thinking, for myself as a queer person, thinking about the fact that queer people have been around forever and have a really long history, and that I'm not the only one, and that everyone's identity is valid, and that's something I really deeply believe, can kind of help me feel calmer and more centered in my own experience and what feels true for me. Focusing even on an affirmation, like maybe distilling some of that into a little mantra for yourself, and thinking about that for about 12 seconds, maybe counting to 10 or something like that. But really, having like a phrase that you come back to in these moments, I think can be really useful. Something like, my experience is valid, or I'm okay as I am, or I love myself in this identity. Whatever the phrase might be for you, just finding something that feels like, yes, this feels true for me. I can hold on to this even when other people are kind of telling me something different, or I have an experience that tries to tell me something different. And when that feels really hard to hold on to, reaching out to someone for support. If there are people in your community or your network that feel really validating, or like they can kind of be cheerleaders for you, or can be mirrors for you that feel really good, that's something to remember and kind of, know that that's there to support you as well.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely, I think that that's great. And I definitely feel like, there are moments where, maybe I was in the women's restroom and someone told me like, you're in the wrong restroom. And it really helped me when I left that situation to tell someone that I was hanging out with, like, oh my gosh, this just happened to me, and have them validate like, wow, that's really insensitive. Because it can be a lot to hold that all by yourself. So I think that that's really helpful. And, when you encounter a moment like that, remembering that it can put you in a fight or flight or freeze response, there are a couple options that you might want to consider for how to manage it. You could ignore it and just walk away. You could confront it and say something to the person in the moment. Or if it's possible, you can go back and address it later. If it's like a friend or a family member or someone that you're in contact with on a regular basis. But all of these strategies are fine. You don't have to confront every microaggression. It doesn't mean that you're supporting what the other person's saying. It doesn't mean that you're not brave or you're not courageous. It's just that I think as queer people, we have to choose our battles, and we don't always want a battle. Sometimes we just want to like walk away and continue with our day. So whatever you choose to do is perfectly fine. But just know that you're in a state of, activation. It may be hard to decide. So just give yourself some compassion for whatever choice you do make in that moment.
Right. Yeah, and one of the things that we might want to consider is, is this microaggression happening with a stranger? And that might, influence how we decide to manage that situation. Or is it happening in a long-term relationship? And sometimes, there's something to think about if that's something that's recurring over and over again. But there's also situations in which, we might be in settings where microaggressions happen and we can't necessarily choose to get away from it. Maybe that's, there's family that isn't necessarily supportive of your identity. Maybe that's being in a workplace where you need those dollars, but you also can't necessarily, that there's things going on that makes that environment uncomfortable. So what do we do in those situations? Hopefully, I would love a reality where no one ever has to be in a situation where microaggressions occur. But working with the reality that we have, I like to think about emotional boundaries. And when I think about emotional boundaries, you may have heard boundaries talked about in terms of being able to say yes or no, or assert our needs. When I think about emotional boundaries, I think about that as the division between me and everyone else. So it's sort of my own container. And choosing what I let into my own container is part of having emotional boundaries for me. So sometimes when I'm in situations where I know a lot of stuff is going to be thrown at me and it's not necessarily going to feel good, I actually think about, this like bubble concept, that maybe I'm just surrounded by a big old pink bubble and everything that's outside, I can choose to filter and leave outside. Or even visualizing maybe armor so that you feel like your self is a little bit protected. So those are some strategies that I think can be useful. And then in terms of going into those situations, if it's something that you can choose to leave if you need to, maybe planning ahead of time, like, okay, this is how I'm going to leave. Like, I'm going to go do this thing because I feel like I have to for some reason, but I'm going to strategize that a friend's going to call me an hour in and I'm going to be like, oh, gotta peace out. Whatever it is that you need to do to kind of feel like, okay, I'm going to be able to manage this a little bit. I'm going to have a plan, and sometimes just going in with a plan is something that can help us feel a little bit better. And then planning for support afterwards. So if this is like, the classic example that comes to mind is like Thanksgiving dinner. It's like, I know that I need to spend a certain amount of time with family. I have my exit strategy, and then I'm going to plan for what I'm going to do afterwards. And maybe that's spending time with community that actually does feel good. Or maybe that's, calling a friend to get support. Or maybe that's just like, I don't know, watching some queer medium like Steven Universe or something that's going to like help you feel a little calmer, a little bit better. And like, you can kind of help yourself come back down to baseline. So those are some different strategies. And obviously there's a lot of different ways that this subject can be talked about and ways to approach it. But we hope that some of these strategies have felt helpful to think about today.
Yeah, and while it seems unrealistic that microaggressions will magically depart from our lives, we hope that we've given you some ideas to help make managing them or dealing with them maybe just a little bit less heinous. So we thank you for being with us for this video, and thank you so much.
Yeah, we wish you all the best, Cal State community. All the love.
Love.
All right, bye.
Bye.